Hey, everybody, it's Joe Solari, and this is the business of writing. I help authors build great businesses. And today we have Alex Newton from k-lytics. If you're not familiar with k-lytics, it's the preeminent analytic service that's out there for authors. We've had Alex on the show at least 2 times, I think maybe 3, and we're going to do another one of those quarterly updates. So welcome to the show, Alex.
Hey, Joe. Thanks for having me, and hi, everybody.
We've been catching up prior to turning on the record button, but it's really good to see you again and to hear what you have to say about what's been going on in the market. Last time, I think it was just before the summer, and you were sharing about how the initial wave of COVID was really good for authors and the Amazon Kindle store. So I'm really interested to just get into the data and you share with us what's going on and what authors should be thinking about in Q3 and Q4.
Happy to do. Yeah, brought a little bit of data. As you say, we're now looking back at basically this, whole pandemic time, and the Amazon Global Select Fund, so the fund which you can take as a bit of a market approximation for at least the KU part of Amazon, which, however, if you look at the bestseller list, is at least indicative of whether things are going up or down. And we can have a look at the development of those numbers, and already saying lots of good news. But what's also interesting is that we do see now really what impact that thing had on certain genres versus others. And there are now certain genres, as you will see in a minute, where the trend has been literally up for 18 months, while before it was down. So the pandemic turned around the whole thing. Now, I'm always cautious with causality versus, okay, there's a correlation, like this famous example where people, I think, once made a correlation between the length of skirts, right, wasn't it, and stock market, that famous story. So just because the skirts get longer or shorter does not mean that causes the stock market to go into a certain direction. So I'm always cautious about this, but it's some of the things are intuitive where you're like, yeah, you can explain it this way. Let's dive into it, have a bit of a look at the number, do a bit of a Q&A. You chime in when you have questions on behalf of your audience.
Sure. Yeah, let's do it.
All you guys know. For those of you, listening to this on the podcast, I will be talking a bit about graphs, but I'll try to describe them so you can visually see them in front of your eyes. And if you don't, you can always go, I think, to Joe's YouTube video or wherever you're going to be hosting the video.
We'll have a page where we'll have a link to the show notes and the graphs, your slides, so that people can look at that if they want to while they're listening to this.
There we go. Now, whichever way this whole thing affected you, I hope everybody of you is doing fine and great, and that we're more than just surviving throughout this period. Let me try to share some good news with you during these days. So just turning on here the screen share right there. So what I'd like to do as an update, let's talk a little bit about the overall market update. Now, there have also been a couple of subtle changes on the Amazon categories. We're not going to go through all of them, but I'm just going to allude to some of them, and you can also look them up. And then I thought, let's talk a little bit about specific genres, what's been happening in romance, what do we see in sci-fi and fantasy, mystery, thriller, suspense, some news on other genres and nonfiction as well. And let's dive right into it. Now, first of all, the overall market. Obviously, you can look at the industry associations, now print and trade has been doing. Today, I want to look at the first project. It's not the first projection. I showed this graph when we met earlier towards the beginning or after the first quarter of the year when the data was in. What you see here in front of us is the Kindle Select Global Fund in US dollars, how it's grown from 32 million in its first year in 2014 when Kindle Unlimited started. It's been going through 300 million threshold in 2019. Wow. Then COVID hit, and 2020, the whole thing grew by 25%, which I always thought, hey, tell me one industry that shows such solid double-digit numbers. And everybody thought, okay, with the pandemic, then the whole thing going back to normal, that's going to slow. We've done the first projection after the first quarter of this year, 2021. And there the projection was, I think, even more than 20%, because around Christmas time in January, the monthly payout to Kindle Unlimited authors had actually grown 30% over the last year. Then during this summer, the growth rate slowed a little bit, always comparing the month with a same month the year before, down to 15% growth, which is still like an outrageous growth number. Now we have the first 3 quarters of actual data, and we currently see that the September year-to-date data is $330 million having been paid out to Kindle Unlimited authors. And by this time of the year, the projection using those 3 months and comparing the 3 quarters and what they represented in all the 3 prior years, it's going to be very stable. So I'm very confident to say we're going to have anything between 18 and 20% another year of growth this year in 2021. Now, obviously, KDP or KU is not the whole market on Amazon, but it is like a great indicator. And I think it's just good news that we see such a tremendous growth here in the second year in a row. I think it's amazing.
Yeah, it is. It's crazy. We're probably we're going to be 5 years from now, this could be $1 billion industry.
And that's the other thing. If you just obviously the performance of what's the disclaimer in stock market bulletins, and performance of the past is never reliable.
Past performance is not an indication of
future performance of your fund. But as we've seen, Amazon is going to stay on the gas pedal on this. And we see, obviously, in that whole equation, also audio is going to be an increasing deal, you name it. But I think it's just good news. Obviously, reading is increasing at 90%. So what is gained there in market share is lost somewhere else. But net, I think during COVID, basically people being at home, people read more, listen more to books. And I think that's good news for authors and publishers. Yeah. Or in this good market environment, Amazon, we all know they probably don't have the Kindle store at the top priority of Amazon's investment list. We all know they very much harvest what they have there when it comes to technical infrastructure. And you know all the frustrations with your dashboards and categories and the clumsiness of everything from advertising down to the process. But here and there, Amazon does make updates, and sometimes they do it to the category structure. Now, I'm not going to bore you with, but just as an example, just on the subcategory level. So once you leave romance and you go into whatever, romance paranormal, romance history. So they made some updates on the subcategory level across the board and also further down. Now, many of these were, say, very unimportant categories. For you, this audience, it's not important to know that you now have a category for comfort food and cookbooks, food and wine, and these sort of things. To some people, it's very interesting. But there were a couple of interesting ones, just to name one here, which I found interesting, that in romance, they now finally introduced something called romance later in life. So we now have a dedicated Amazon category for those. If you go onto the Amazon website and you start typing romance into the search bar, you very often, once you add the letter F to it, Amazon will prompt like romance for teens, romance for women, romance for men. But pretty high up there, it's romance for seniors, romance for women 50 plus. So it seems there, while on Google search interest, by the way, it's not reflected. It's a very Amazon, a very book specific thing where probably people are basically looking for at least like there's this phenomenon of midlife fiction, especially in urban fantasy, cozy mystery, paranormal women's fiction. We saw a lot. We saw a huge increase in women's fiction per se, which is usually targeted. If you look at the protagonists in the book, like starting over, the kids are out of school, there's the divorce, and the woman buys this little beach house and refurbishes it, and there's this guy, and so on and so forth. Now we also have this later in life category. We will keep monitoring it, and that Amazon does these changes on that level is at least they still care somewhat for how the store looks like. Even if they were to introduce categories that finally reflect some of the big markets, such as billionaire romance on the Kindle store or mafia romance, or there isn't even a lit RPG or a game lit category. And so sometimes you don't know how they come to these decisions, but they at least they do things on these bestseller list. All right, with this, let's dive into some of these genres. For those of you, just to recap, as long as you stay on the top level, the picture across the board has not changed in relative terms. So you have, if we neglect the big umbrella categories, literature and fiction and nonfiction, romance number one, then mystery, thriller, suspense, then sci-fi and fantasy. Now that's the Kindle picture. If you put this up for audio, it's going to look a bit the other way around. You will have more sci-fi and fantasy, I think, number one, a lot of nonfiction, and then romance has got to be further down in the audio format. But here with the big lead market here, Kindle Unlimited for across formats, still the number one. So we're going to take it in this sequence a bit. We're going to be looking at romance, a bit at mystery, thriller, suspense. I think I have sci-fi second in this presentation, then a bit of nonfiction and teen young adult. Let's have a look what's happening over there in these markets. Romance. So for the romance authors amongst you, and by the way, if you're a mystery, thriller, suspense, or sci-fi, you should watch this too, because some of the trends I see actually happening across the board. Just by the way, for the performance of this later in life category, that's an interesting detail to mention. For those of you who are new to this, I'm in front of what we call the k-lytics strategy map, which is a fancy term for putting a lot of snowflakes on one diagram, and each snowflake is a category, the dot is a category, and the higher up the category is, the better is the Amazon average sales rank that is achieved on average in that category. And the further the category is to the right of the graph, the higher the level of competition. Now, romance later in life is like an interesting one, because you can imagine after more than 10 years of Kindle, many of the romance categories are extremely crowded, and you're looking at book portfolios in paranormal romance of what, more than 60,000 titles or so. Of course, crazy, yeah. It's like a Library of Congress, because Amazon doesn't purge the things, and a measure of competition would become in due course probably also just the number of titles added per month. So what is the supply growth rate? And I can share an example of this new analysis in a second for another subgenre in romance. But here, just look at it, the category size of English-speaking titles of that fledgling later in life romance, it's just 776 titles. And the sales rank is already up there in the top 1,200s, which is very high already. So it's almost off the chart in the green zone. And it was funny because you saw some of the more experienced authors immediately jumping at putting their book into the category. So the first ones to hijack it were, by the way, all the women's fiction authors who frankly only have a dash of romance in many of their like beach house romance novels or women's fiction novels. They all put it in there, but if you go into the bestseller list now, you find actually a couple of romance authors who are like specifically targeting this true later in life romance segment without much competition at this point. In romance overall, here's the big good news. Romance was like one of the beneficiaries of the whole pandemic. What you see here is actually the graph at the start of the pandemic all the way up to present time. So this is the average sales rank across the overall romance top 100. And while the average of those 100 titles was down when the pandemic hit in 2020, it dropped down to 170 on average Amazon Kindle store, which is like super sky high in the store, but relatively speaking, it dropped. And then it resurged towards Christmas. And ever since, there's a slight positive trend, and the whole romance genre was like raised to another, say, plateau. Never before did we have that performance. So whatever the pandemic did, people did read romance, which I found counterintuitive, because if everybody's staying at home, you should have more romance at home, but perhaps people had too much disappointment then at home and turned to the romance.
Or nobody to romance with at home.
Exactly. So that's the overall situation. Interestingly, that increase in relative market share did not come at the expense of price drops. In fact, what's been happening is that the romance ebook prices over the last 18 months were also, with neglecting all the monthly ups and downs, if you put a trend line through it, we have a very solid increase in price levels as well, from an average around $4.10 at the start of the pandemic. We're now here at $4.83. And this picture, I thought, let's have another look, because I remember when I started tracking the market 5-6 years ago, I remember times where we suddenly say, oh my God, the average price of the top 100 romance titles has dropped below $3. And that is where you also had like traditional publishers up there. And I said, wow, what's happening there? So what I did for this show, I just pulled the last 7 years of data, of price data for the romance genre. And you find something really astonishing. So for those of you listening, we have here a 7-year monthly price evolution of the romance genre. And if you were to cut a line through it, we saw from 2014 all the way to almost mid 2017, we had an ever decreasing price level from a trend perspective in romance, with a low point in May 2017. Top 100 romance novels, the average across them all was as low as $2.37. And ever since then, we have a steady growth in prices. Now, leading up, actually, this month was the highest price we had in 7 years with $4.83. And it could well be that we go through this magical $5 threshold in due course.
Yeah, I would think that for folks that are looking at this in romance, this doesn't surprise me that they can get more money for their book. It surprises me that people are committing to a price increase. But when you think about it, they're different markets, right? So if you think about it, a typical romance author, probably 70% of their earnings come from KU, right? Where they don't get a say in the price. Commissar Bezos tells us what the price will be. And then you have this other market where you do have the opportunity to ask for more money, and they're different customer segments. And I know, again, I haven't seen any hard data on it, but the anecdotal thing is well, I raised my price in my KU sales.
I didn't catch that. And my KU sales
went up.
Yeah.
So like you see it where people raise their price. Now they're getting more per book. So they're seeing their regular sales go up, but then at the same time, they'll see their page reads go up. So
because the subscription becomes even more valuable, the merchandise becomes more valuable. So I totally interesting. Yeah, I don't have the KU share versus the non-KU share here, but what we did see across all our genre reports where we track what is the share of KU titles versus non-KU titles in the bestsellers, in almost any report we've doing in 2021, we saw an increase in the share of KU, as we've already seen in the year before. So the bestseller list share of KU is constantly growing, it seems. And people jump at it right away and say, so Amazon is favoring KU. Well, we know they treat in the sales rank algorithm for the bestsellers, they treat the straight sale exactly the same as the borrow, the download. So from that perspective, you could argue, yes, they are giving some preferential treatment to KU indirectly through that sales rank algorithm. But what is interesting, in fact, they're not, because if you go to the popularity list, and if you just type in a search romance or any subgenre, you will see that in the first 2-3 pages, the books that are being suggested to you, to the prospective buyer, over proportionally, I will collect some hard data on it, but just looking over it, you will find an over proportional share of non-KU items, meaning Amazon will, I would do the same, saying, hey, the subscription is already paid, so why suggest something to a person who's looking for something to give it away for free? No, I offer those merchandise, which is not in the subscription. Interesting phenomenon. All right, next, here we go. So a couple of updates within the genres. We have here, just a second to move this little icon here. So what do we have here? A couple of subgenres where we saw a particular upward motion. One is the fantasy and futuristic romance. Usually people would refer to it as fantasy romance, and that bestseller list has really been soaring. So all these books, like what is a type of Zodiac Academy, you have urban fantasy, you have paranormal romance, where usually, unless it's like a portal fantasy or something, it's still urban in nature. So the city, and here the romance is more shifting into the fantasy world. So we see all these fae romance, fairy tale retelling type of things, but also paranormal romance, but in a non-urban setting, which makes it fantasy romance. Now that whole thing has been growing like crazy ever since the start of the pandemic. And so that is one big thing we've been seeing over the last 18 months. The other is, in general, we saw a big renaissance of paranormal romance. Now, who would have thought this? The big high times was back in 2013, 14, 2015, that was when paranormal romance was like the big thing. And ever since it was on a downturn. And just to show you, here's one of the paranormal romance bestsellers now, not over 18 months, but over 5 years. And we see that ever since the high time in 2016, we had a downward trend in werewolf and shifter romance. Obviously, in that category, you will find also other paranormal themes, not just werewolves and shifters, but it's an interesting indicator category. It's been dropping. And especially at the start of the pandemic, paranormal took yet another hit. And it was like putting a nail into the coffin of a 4 or 5 year decline. And then with the mid of the pandemic, we see this huge surge, not just in shifter romance, but you see suddenly shifters and paranormal, the orange flame type of covers all over the place again. So interesting. Werewolves, vampires, they never die.
No pun intended.
Exactly. So that's a big one. Then we did some cross-category type of research this year. Some of you may have seen it. We've issued a first report on, I always dodged this genre. We've done a big dedicated report just on billionaire romance to see whether it's just vampires or also billionaires that never die. And you may remember this one chart, Joe, which I did show before with this phenomenon of the 50 Shades of Grey back in 2014, hitting the big screen. And that then in the year 2014-15, we had this big search on Google for billionaire romance interest. Now, while the blockbuster, the movie stuff, the hype died down only within months after the movies, the interest for the theme continued to be there. Now, what I was interested in to shed a bit more light on book supply, we did an analysis where we basically tracked the number of books that were published every month with a keyword billionaire romance, or the term billionaire in the title and category being romance. And that's hugely interesting because the blue line that you see here, which peaked in 2015, is the monthly number of new books. So imagine every month we have some 250, at that time we had some 250 to 300 new billionaire romance books come out every month.
So now, let me stop you there. So for folks that are listening, that's just one category focused really on this trope of billionaires. 250 books per month.
Back in 2015.
Yeah.
And at the time, it's almost like today. At the time was like almost half, or say 60% KU and the rest non-KU. And after the movie died down, so the red line is a continued interest, is the Google search interest for billionaire romance, the exact search word. And publishing activities not died down, but went back to about 100 new novels a month, which is still huge. But you see, there was like really this golden time in 2017 to 2018, even early 2019. And what's so interesting currently, and that's why I did this special report on billionaire romance, is we have now a constant uptick in publishing activity again. So now we are back to about 200 books a month with billionaire romance themes, but we also have a rise in interest. So this whole billionaire trope, like vampires never die, billionaires neither do they. And even to the extent that we had like a huge number of Chinese spam uploads during this summer, where they just uploaded mock-ups and priced them. So ridiculous. They never sell these spam copycat or some Chinese translations. Very odd thing. Anyway, the point I wanted to make is it's very interesting these days to see how supply and demand develops for a very specific trope or theme or subgenre, whatever you name it. And within billionaire romance, you can even dig further down. And the big thing, I will have a special report next week on this big mafia romance trope, where you have now the billionaires being whatever the big mafia guys. And it's probably, I'm anxious to see what the report is. It's probably the adult equivalent to what we have as the bully romance phenomenon in teen young adult romance. Is probably happening here where perhaps the billionaire romance readers go over to that one. I don't know, but it's a strange thing, strange phenomenon, but it's happening and it's creating a huge book market. All right, that was a bit of,
I don't know if you're I don't know if you're going to get into it, but just to give folks a context for what's going on in the marketplace, what's your data show as far as where we're at as number of titles total
Oh, total. They stopped displaying it on the page. So
Mhm.
they always cap it and say, if you type in paranormal romance, it would either sell over 50,000 titles or over 60,000. It's either one of the two values where they cap it. But we're tracking the monthly increment, the 30-day increment across all of those, which you can still accurately determine for 95% of the genres. So I haven't looked up the number this month, but when you only count the English-speaking titles, we've broken through the 8 million title threshold in total across the board on Kindle. And romance is the number 2 or number 1 in that book supply. I think only religion and spirituality is bigger, with, I think by now, more than 500,000-600,000 titles on it.
Wow.
Yeah, it's become a crowded place. But the good news is, look at this category like we just had with romance later in life. There you talk still less than 2,000 titles, and not all of them are being aggressively marketed. So as these new things come up, the next theme, say, take mafia romance or take the Fae romance things that were happening, those people who were early in it and built their fan base on it, they keep harvesting usually for a bit of time. Take the women's fiction author. There were a couple, I think 2, 3, 4 years back going into that one. And now you see these covers all over the place with the beach house, right? But it's these people have been harvesting certain niche markets for a good period in time and successfully continue to. So,
well, this also gets into what I talked about in Advantage, that if this was a true supply demand market, authors couldn't make any money, right? There's an oversupply. If anybody saw every book as an equal substitute for another, then why would anybody pay $5 for a book? Because there's an endless supply of books lower cost. So what happens, and I think that's one of the most powerful things about your genre reports, is you can actually go in and look in a genre and see really how steep that curve is, that within a bestseller list specific to a genre, you have these group of authors, and maybe they're the original ones in it, or they're more prolific. There's a million reasons why, but they are capturing a large percentage of the market and will continue to do. And then there's
that's another interesting thing you mentioned, the sustainability, that now that we've covered a couple of genres over 4 or 5 years, that say 30-40% sometimes of the top authors in one year would be a top author in the next year as well.
Yeah. I always say it's similar to like professional tennis, right? It's not to say you can't get into the top rank, but there are people that once they're up there, they stay there for a while until they get too old to play tennis anymore.
That's a funny analogy. A couple of writers who stay there until they become too old to hit the typewriter. And then they have still 5 years of dictation software. And then they can afford an assistant to, take down. And that's funny. Yeah. So let's talk a bit about sci-fi as well. Also there, we have a phenomenon that, again, let's look at the sales rank performance of the top 100 as an indicator of the top end of the market. And as we know, the top end often represents 80% of the whole market. So here we have sci-fi, and the top 100, as I said, the straight line all the way here from 2020 April, where the pandemic hit, to present time, was in July. We had the highest ever sales rank performance in sci-fi and fantasy that we've seen in a long time. Now, obviously, you're going to be saying, okay, what is sci-fi and what is fantasy in driving that? We're just working on the final edits of the sci-fi and fantasy report, and I think I can already say fantasy has been driving this more than sci-fi, right? Both are escapist reads, and we would often see during the pandemic, whether it's humorous fiction, whether it's lighter reads, share gain. So did the big escapist genres. Fantasy more so than science fiction, but also the one or other sci-fi title was increasing. When we compare it, by the way, with the prices, also here the similar phenomenon as in romance, although that's not that steep an increase in prices here. It's probably more flat to a slightly upward trend, at least very stable prices in the top 100 between $5.50 and $6. So in general, higher price levels still than we have in romance. Although Also, this will vary by genre, where we have obviously traditionally published titles very high and more fantasy romance type of titles lower. But good news also here, we don't see big anomalies or price drops. When we go into certain genres, just to drive the story home on what you might find intuitive on a pandemic, here we have a 5-year trend line of the post-apocalyptic sci-fi and dystopian sci-fi genre over a period of 5 years. And here you can almost see that when the pandemic started in March, this whole genre took a dive. But what I personally found interesting is, and here's where you really have to be careful about causality, because if you carefully look at the graph, the whole post-apocalyptic and dystopian thing was on an uptrend until September 2019, and then it started this decline. So the decline started before the pandemic hit. And here I personally think in the post-apocalyptic realm, The Walking Dead, I think it was the last season. So there are some Netflix factors here probably at play as well. Similar in the dystopian, where we had obviously the Handmaid's Tale and then the sequel to it, and then the big hype, and then nothing else came. And sometimes I find that the pandemic in some genres almost acted like not the cause for something, but almost like a catalyst. Where a trend was down, it became even more downtrending, or a trend was up and it became even more uptrending. So that's what's been happening to the more dire, darker post-apocalyptic and dystopian worlds. They clearly did not benefit if you now look at this from a big step back type of 5-year perspective.
Yeah, it makes sense.
On the other hand, though, there were beneficiaries also in science fiction and fantasy. So if you look at, also there's books tactically being put in there, but I'm going to skip over this here pretty briefly. As said, all the categories that have to do with humor and entertainment, some of them greatly benefited. And here in specific, if you look at fantasy gaming type of categories, and the cousin genre, sci-fi, fantasy, TV, movie, video game adaptations. So whether it's lit RPG books, or it's books related to a certain series, or just things that sort of fit that type of target audience, here we saw clearly an increase over the last 18 months, and especially also more recently. And also for the hard sci-fi fans, again, here, if you look at it from a 5-year perspective, yes, we did have The Martian and all these sort of things. But overall, hard sci-fi was on a 2-3 year downward trend up until the pandemic. And then, while very volatile, if you put a trend line through it, we got a bit of a rejuvenation of the whole thing. Now, we all know, especially in sci-fi, many books being miscategorized. But even if you look at it as a rough gauge, and hey, at least something is happening there. And then obviously we need to go into the bestsellers and see what type of books in specific have been driving a certain trend. So overall, good news in sci-fi and fantasy, especially the fantasy side of things. Epic fantasy, by the way, would have been on the rise as well. Anything escapist worked very well during the pandemic. Mystery, thrill, suspense. Also here we saw actually a pretty flat performance over the first year of the pandemic. And now over the last, say, 6 months, mystery, thrill, suspense all of a sudden has seen a strong upward motion again. At first, I thought it could be to do with a big price drop we've seen in MTS book prices during summer. We usually don't have big fluctuations, but there we saw a big price drop, and it was not data outliers. So we looked at all of the books, and it was like legitimate. All of a sudden, you had like more 99 cents, 199, 299 price points in there, even in the top 100, which was very unusual for MTS books. So it was a big price drop, but it's been coming back up. So that increase in sales was not like purchased, I felt. And within the genres, I think the most remarkable one that we've seen, where I thought that's the only one of the exceptions to the rule, where you say in the pandemic you only had like more light-hearted type of novels. The one contrast in here is domestic thrillers, usually like dark psychological murder and mayhem in the family or small town surroundings. Domestic thriller extremely well performing, so much though that on the before mentioned strategy map that we mentioned, it's almost off the chart. Why? Wow. Because the sales ranks of the mystery thriller, suspense, domestic thrillers books are like sky high in the store, while the size of the category, if you look at domestic thrillers within MTS, it's still less than 3,000 titles. In fact, at the point in time, only 2,500 English-speaking titles in the category. Now, if you do the keyword search, there are more for domestic thrillers because people start recognizing how successful a keyword that is and start bidding for it, even if their novel is vaguely domestic thriller in the literary definition sense of the word. But that's a good one currently to be in MTS. Last but not least, other genres. What do we see there? I think we haven't covered teen young adult yet. Teen young adult, always a bit volatile. It goes up and down. We also saw in the pandemic, here's the sales rank over the last 18 months, where especially in the first 2 months of the lockdowns, I think teens did two things aside from trying to do some homeschooling or not doing it, watching Netflix, being on the mobile phone. And when the parents said enough of mobile phone, perhaps they've read a bit more books again. So we all know kids books and teen young adult books were on the rise. The short peak we had here in May, June 2020, then it went down again. Then here, next wave, especially after Christmas, we see this rise. Now it's on the downturn again. So teen young adult, it's always difficult to see real trends there. But once you go to the lower levels, the tropes, the subcategory, here things do start happening. This is a very interesting one where I brought you another 5-year trend line, because the 5-year trend line really allows to show what happened before the pandemic and what happened during, hopefully soon after the pandemic. And in teen young adult, paranormal fantasy romance, so most of this is like urban fantasy romance and paranormal romance, but more geared towards the young adult type of audience. That category was literally on a 3.5-year decline, all after the big hype in 2015. That one was on a constant rank dropping. And then in March 2020, as you see on this chart, it started going up like crazy again. Now it's in September 21, cooling off a little. But if you just look at a trend line, this was one of the clear beneficiaries of during the pandemic. Last but not least,
just one other thing that you made me think about is there seems to be some folks that tend to jump from genre chasing trends, is that with your data, you can see that there is life cycles, right? There's ebbs and flows, and maybe your particular genre that you want to write in might lose some popularity for a period of time. These things tend to come back.
I agree. It's a bit like the fashion industry, perhaps cycles. And and there is 2 examples. I don't have the graph now here with me, but obviously last Christmas, 25th of December, 2020, Netflix puts out Bridgerton, right?
Yeah.
In the ensuing month, a bestseller list that had lost ground over the years, historical romance, especially Regency romance, shot all the way back up. And it was up there like 2-3 months, and then slowly it went down again. And even now, all of the leading books in Regency romance are usually Julia Quinn's Bridgerton series. Some of these things can be externally induced and can be a bit short-lived. I'd say Regency romance is one example where one Netflix thing really gave a spark, but things went back to normal quickly. The earlier example we had, like Billionaire romance, it's the blockbuster movie was the impetus, but what stayed behind would become a 7-year book trend. Same thing with Twilight and vampire romance. And it's going to be interesting to see. I cannot predict which one is going to be short, which is slow, but I think by and large, once a thing gets going, especially in the book market, there is a certain inertia that makes the book market much more sustained than many of the other more short-lived media formats.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and we'll see. For example, in the next year, I'm very curious to see what's going to be. We will do another epic fantasy study, because epic fantasy was very successful. And I understand, has it been released yet? I don't think so. The big Amazon version, Amazon Prime version of Lord of the Rings, obviously. And I think if I read correctly, it's the highest budget television series ever produced. So there is big money behind those things, and obviously a big promotion engine. So I currently in my webinars tell people, hey, look at the Netflix production schedule to see what's coming in a year's time.
Well, and you look at what's going on right now with Dune.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
That book that was written in 1966 is in the top 10 again.
I tell you, let's see whether we have Back to the Future one more time. All these things of our youth. So
yeah, I'm sure they'll do a rehash of those.
Last not least, before we close, and then looking at too many numbers at a time and trend graphs at a time make people and listeners probably dizzy. But the one overall thing you should be aware of is we have this tension between fiction and nonfiction on Kindle, right? And or tension meaning two competing segments, because they compete for market share on the device. And usually we all know that the average bestseller rank of literature and fiction, for those who look at the graph, it's a red line. It's fairly flat and extremely stable over the years. And nonfiction has always trended lower than fiction, but stably. So the distance between the flat literature and fiction line and the flat nonfiction line would always be a distance of average sales rank literature and fiction in the top 100 of the store. Nonfiction, say around the 400, 500 mark in the store. What we saw ever since the pandemic, there was a brief surge in May 2019, May 2019, and probably everybody downloaded books about infectious diseases and how to bake your own bread and all that sort of stuff and how to stay fit. That was a quick surge, but ever since we have a decline in nonfiction, and it has not recovered from that decline yet. And I find this pretty remarkable. Obviously, back in 2015, 16, the Kindle gold digging times when you had every John, Dick, and Harry upload their nonfiction books, and the 50,000 Law of Attraction book and self-help book, all that stuff. Here, I think the law of supply and demand is really kicking in, where, there's endless supply, junks and junks of books out there where the one person copied from the other, basing the next book off the table and look inside table of content of the previous book. And here you just see it doesn't resonate with readers, and the channel has been losing ground over the last 18 months.
Does this figure in audiobook sales as well? Or is this just the Kindle store?
No, this is just Kindle. And obviously you will pose the interesting question, how many nonfiction consumers have shifted from the reading format to the audio format?
I know I can only speak for myself. I know I'm all in now on audio because I can just consume more books. I can do it at a faster speed. I can do it when I'm doing other stuff. So I wonder if that's an interesting thing to explore as far as how much people are. It's just a transference. It's not necessarily, it's the medium that's really getting punished, not
Absolutely. We shall see in due course as we hopefully have more data on audio as well. As you say, the initial measurement we took of the audio market was clearly showing nonfiction continue to be the ones. I personally would have thought, with people no longer driving to work but staying at home, that actually some of the audiobook sales may have suffered because people don't consume so much anymore by not spending so much time in the traffic jam anymore, listening to audiobooks. But there's no hard data to back it up. And hopefully we have soon some more hard data on this. But for those of you who are in nonfiction, it's something I think just generally to be aware of. Only publish nonfiction when you really have something to say and bring some new value to the market, instead of, I'm not saying that your listeners are doing this, but I've seen so many just copycat books flooding the market with no value added whatsoever to the readers.
I think there's some get rich quick schemes right now where it's like you can produce low content books on Amazon, and if you don't, it only takes about 15 minutes of research to understand that's an impossibility. But if you get some compelling Facebook ad and you think that this is going to be the deal, then you may fall for that. And like you say, there's a lot of junk books out there.
All right. That's case in somewhere it's even innovative. If I had been the person inventing adult coloring books, I'd be very happy. I remember, what was it, 6 years ago, when the top 100 in Canada or something, there was almost so much coloring books, or now journals and things. If they target certain niches and they're easy to produce, fine. But if you start copying, copycat whatever is out there in the market in the hope for this quick buck, it's a complete illusion. It doesn't work.
There may be another thing. I don't know if you'd be able to see this, but I would say in certain industries, let's take the financial planning industry, right? Hundreds of thousands of financial planners and money managers. They'll want to write a book. The reason they're writing a book on having wealth into your retirement is because they're seeing that as getting some space on Amazon as a search engine, and having
like a business card.
It's essentially a business card, or that when they do their seminars, they can hand out their book and it gives them some authority. So while they may never be ever thinking that book is going to become a #1 bestseller, it's still bringing supply into the market, because for that person in their whatever town they're in, it makes them look a little more proud.
And here has my total endorsement. To write nonfiction as a proof of authority, you have my blessing. To write nonfiction as in the hope for a source of income, unless you're a big hitter with big advertising budgets and inroads into the airport stores and these sort of things, and you have the PR manager who brings you into these local breakfast morning shows in the US, then nonfiction is a business. No, but for the average, I just upload my Kindle book. No way.
Yeah, for sure.
All right.
Oh, it's been really great having you on and catching up, Alex. I really appreciate all the work you put into getting this content together for us.
Thank you so much for having me again here.
Yeah. And you want to tell people how they can find you and where, what various things you offer to help them figure all this stuff?
Sure. Very briefly, come find us at k-lytics.com. That's k-lytics.com. I can just put it up here on the screen for you also to illustrate. So basically what we have is we have a big database of category performance that we update monthly. And so far it's focused on Kindle. We do have some initial data on audio as well on request, and we keep working on that. And then we have all those genre reports where each genre is covered with a 70-page, 90-page thing with a video like this one, where I take you through the results, covering anything from cozy mystery to whatever paranormal, women's fiction, and epic fantasy. And those two things, they're delivered either through a membership, especially if you're a professional or want to stay abreast of the market every month or want to see what's happening across genres. We offer a premium or elite membership tier. If you're on a budget or just want to have this one spark of data to inform your next book project, you can also procure the genre reports individually in the store. And you're welcome to check it out. It's k-lytics.com, which is k-lytics.com, which is very simply dropping the Indle from the Kindle, because it once was we wanted to start out with Kindlelytics 7 years ago, but my lawyer told me not to get into a brand dispute with a very well-known ebook device and content supplier.
I would just, to add in this, is if you're a beginning author and you're evaluating a genre that you want to write in, those genre reports is money well spent in your research. It's going to save you hours and hours of time because you've done all that work. You've got what the covers look like. You've got the blurbs in there. You create these bestseller lists for that genre, like just pretending.
Especially where you don't have a bestseller list, we create what we call the virtual bestseller list, where based on many searches over time, we construct our own one. Once we did, by the way, things like a lit RPG report or game lit report, there is no Amazon category, nor there was any for this billionaire romance thing, because people put it from contemporary romance all the way to some obscure literature and fiction genres. So you have to work cross category as well. This is where those come handy. And yeah, if I were to summarize it in one word, Joe, it's really market research at the fingertips. So I always say research less, write more, because you're a writer. you should be focusing on the writing and not on, spending endless time on Amazon bestseller lists and then even not making sense after it because they all fluctuate by the hour and you don't get the big picture. Yeah, it's research done for you, and you're always welcome to check it out at k-lytics.com or send me an email if you have questions. You can always reach me at support@k-lytics.com. Just put attention, Alex, or podcast with Joe, and it will be routed to me.
Awesome. Well, good seeing you again, and we'll be talking.
Absolutely.
Later.
Thanks a lot, and bye, everybody.
Bye.